team months after the FBI launched its Russia investigation, according to a new Politico report. Manafort resigned from the Trump campaign last August, but according to Politico, he called Donald Trump's chief of staff, Reince Priebus, about a week before Inauguration Day to discuss the Russia scandal, according to 4 people familiar with the call. Manafort wanted to brief Trump's team on alleged inaccuracies in a recently released dossier of memos written by a former British spy for Trump's opponents that alleged compromising ties among Russia, Trump, and Trump's associates, including Manafort. And joining us now is Ken Vogel, chief investigative reporter for Politico, who broke this story. And also joining us, David Corn, Washington bureau chief of Mother Jones and an MSNBC political analyst. So, Ken, this is a pretty blockbuster story. And among the many interesting details in it is this one, that Manafort, according to your story, discussed with other Trump allies the possibility of launching a countervailing investigation into efforts by Ukrainian government officials who allegedly worked in conjunction with allies of Trump's Democratic rival Hillary Clinton to damage Trump's campaign, according to a GOP operative. The operative added that Manafort saw such an investigation as a way to distract attention from the parallel FBI and congressional Russia probes. The idea that Manafort was advising the incoming administration to launch essentially a phony investigation? I mean, what?
Yeah, I mean, we actually did some reporting on this, and there was some evidence to suggest that certain officials in the Ukrainian government, both in the embassy here as well as in Kiev, were trying to push out this damaging information about Manafort, and Manafort and his allies believed that it was all an effort to damage Donald Trump. Obviously, it was nowhere near the concerted effort that we saw from the Russian government, including the hacking and the pushing out of fake news and the like. So it is interesting that Manafort is trying to conflate these two things to suggest that he is somehow the victim, and that by casting attention, if the Trump administration were to cast attention on this much less significant Ukrainian meddling, then it would somehow clear him and clear the Trump folks of any kind of wrongdoing or suspicion in these ongoing, at that point, heating up investigations into their coordination or potential coordination with Russia.
But at the same time, though, David Corn, if Paul Manafort wants to go fishing around in the origins of that dossier, he wouldn't find it ended with Hillary Clinton. Reportedly, the Clinton team wound up with that information, but that it was originally sourced to one of the Republican rivals of Donald Trump and wound up in John McCain's hands at one point. I mean, there really is no way to isolate that dossier in the Hillary Clinton camp. What do you make of this idea that Paul Manafort was, A, advising the Trump campaign, or at least trying to, and still talking to them after he himself was under scrutiny?
Well, I think you see from everyone in Trump's circles over the last 6 months efforts to deflect and obstruct. This falls probably more into the categories of deflect, as Ken reported, and kudos to him for the story, about trying to come up with this alternative narrative. It's all about alternative narratives. And I think as you get into the obstruction side, conversations that Manafort has with Reince Priebus or anything else, I mean, Ken and Politico reported what they know about these conversations. But the question I have, just as a reader of the story, as another reporter, is what other conversations were there? What else happened in these conversations? These are all things now that the special counsel is going to have to look at, and whether Paul Manafort, who's a very creative guy who's made millions of dollars helping politicians avoid responsibility around the globe, what else he was suggesting, what other conversations Reince Priebus was having with outside Republicans and with people who worked on the campaign. We see indications again and again and again that there were multiple conversations about what do we do to push back, to fight, or to block this investigation. That's all fodder for the special counsel.
Yeah, and 0 conversations about how do we prevent Russia from interfering in our elections. Ken Vogel,
yes, so far, not one
conversation
that we know
about that. David Corn just mentioned, you know, how many conversations, additional conversations with Reince Priebus. But Ken, your story also reports that Paul Manafort continued to talk not just to members of Trump's team, but had at least 2 conversations with Donald Trump himself, according to people close to Manafort and Trump. The reason that's important, of course, is that you had the New York Times reporting yesterday specifically about Paul Manafort that senior Russian intelligence and political officials were discussing how to exert influence over Donald J. Trump through his advisors. And those conversations focused on Paul Manafort, the Trump campaign chairman at the time, and Michael Flynn, the retired general who was advising Trump. Both men had indirect ties to Russian officials who appeared confident that each of them could be used to help shape Trump's opinions on Russia. So you have somebody, Manafort, who's not just talking to Reince Priebus, but who's talking to Trump himself despite the fact the Russians saw him as an agent of influence.
Yeah, that's right. We understand that Manafort continued to talk with people very close to Trump, including Jared Kushner, throughout the campaign after he was forced to resign from the campaign, not coincidentally because of news reporting about his ties to the pro-Russian former Ukrainian Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych, and that he additionally did talk to Trump at least twice. We do have some dispute about how many times and when he talked to Trump. Manafort certainly led folks to believe that he was talking to Trump often, right up until the Russia investigation heated up. We don't know precisely when that was. We have some pushback from folks close to Trump saying no, it was much less frequent. But clearly there is an open channel of communication here. And as David suggested, it's not just between Manafort or folks involved in this, who are being looked at and Trump. In fact, we know that Trump texted Mike Flynn saying stay strong. But it's also Trump's team and the FBI. There was that report from CNN that right after Trump asked Comey to stand down on some of this stuff, that Priebus called the FBI, called both Comey and his deputy director, and asked them if they could come out and say something to refute reports about communications between Trump's team and the Russians during the campaign. So all this is going to feed into the sort of handling of the investigation as opposed to the actual meat of the interactions between Trump's team and Russia.
And David, do we have any reporting, and maybe kind of you would know either, does Manafort still live in Trump Tower?
I understand that he does have the apartment there still, yes.
Yeah, the apartment doesn't seem to have been sold. And his real estate, I mean, that's the other thing. He's been under investigation, too, for the way he's done his banking and for payments in Ukraine and putting money through the Cyprus Bank. There's a lot here that he or anybody, we talked Jared Kushner earlier in the show, that once the FBI starts looking at you, it's never a good thing, but it also gives the FBI leverage if they find anything else on getting you to tell the story that may lead to others.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to find out if there were any conversations that happened at their mutual address on Fifth Avenue. David Cord and Ken Vogel, thanks for joining us. Thank you both. And coming up, thank you. Coming up next, the other big break.